On a cold night, Guillermo Castro, a man accustomed to the silence of solitude, wandered aimlessly through the wet streets of New York City. The pain of loss was still recent, and he sought an escape from the thoughts that tormented him in the darkness. When his eyes caught sight of a solitary figure on the bridge, something in him changed. The young woman was about to commit the unthinkable, and Guillermo knew that if he didn't act quickly, her fate would be sealed forever. Without thinking, he ran toward her, determined to save a life that, at that moment, seemed as lost as his own. What he didn't know was that by grasping that trembling hand, he would not only be saving her, but also plunging himself into a series of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. She almost gave up, but an act of courage changed everything. The incredible journey of Guillermo and Anastasia. Guillermo felt the weight of the cold, damp night as he walked across the Williamsburg Bridge, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, trying, unsuccessfully, to ward off the chill that seemed to come from within. Each step echoed on the metal structure, as if the emptiness around him amplified the loneliness he carried in his chest since the death of his wife. The days dragged on in a painful monotony, and he often wondered what kept him standing, what still made him leave the house other than pure habit. His thoughts were interrupted when he spotted, a few meters away, a figure hunched over the bridge railing. The dim light from the street lamps revealed a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, with her gaze fixed on the river below. Her dark hair fluttered in the wind, and the way she clung to the railing indicated that she was about to do something drastic. Guillermo quickened his pace, thinking only of the urgency to prevent what was about to happen. "Hey!" his voice rasped, cutting through the silence around him. "Wait!" The young woman turned slowly, revealing a face marked by exhaustion and pain. Her large, dark eyes were red, as if they had cried more than they could bear. She stared at him, motionless, as if she wasn't sure if he was real or just another shadow in that desperate night. "Don't do this," he said, cautiously approaching, keeping his hands in sight to avoid scaring her. "Whatever the reason, it's not worth ending everything like this." She hesitated, her fingers relaxing slightly on the railing. "You don't know what I've been through," she murmured, her voice almost carried away by the wind. "Maybe I don't," Guillermo replied, "but I'm here, and I want to listen. Let me help." What happened next was a long pause filled with tension. The world seemed to stop. The only thing that existed was that moment, that decision. Guillermo extended his hand, daring not to move closer, hoping she would make the choice for herself. Finally, the young woman let out a trembling sigh, as if releasing all her lost hopes. Slowly, she stepped back from the railing, still holding his hand, as if that were the only thing anchoring her to reality. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a mix of distrust and despair. "My name is Guillermo," he answered softly. "Let's get out of here. Find a warmer place. Can I buy you a coffee?" She looked at him, as if trying to read the intentions behind his words. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Okay." As they walked toward the end of the bridge, Guillermo felt a strange sense of purpose beginning to form inside him. Perhaps by saving that young woman, he was also beginning to save himself. Guillermo and the young woman walked in silence through the almost deserted streets of New York. The headlights of passing cars occasionally cast dancing shadows on the walls of the surrounding buildings, while the distant sound of the city continued its relentless nighttime symphony. He led her to a small cafe, a place he knew well, far from the bustle of the main avenues and curious eyes. The bell above the door chimed softly as they entered, and the warmth of the space contrasted with the cold that still clung to their clothes. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingled with the sweet aroma of freshly baked pastries. The young woman looked around, a bit suspicious, but followed Guillermo to a table in the corner, where he gently pulled out a chair for her to sit. He ordered 2 coffees, and as they waited, Guillermo observed her in silence. She seemed much younger under the soft light of the cafe, but her face, despite being beautiful, bore the marks of someone who had already lived much more than she should have at her age, as deep dark circles under her eyes and a weary expression indicated an internal struggle that Guillermo could barely imagine. Finally, he broke the silence. "What's your name?" "Anastasia," she replied, her voice sounding firmer now. "And you?" "Guillermo," he repeated with a soft smile. "You look tired, Anastasia. Do you want to tell me what happened?" She lowered her eyes to the coffee that had just arrived, holding the warm cup with both hands as if seeking comfort in that simple gesture. For a long moment, it seemed she was battling within herself, deciding whether or not to open her soul to this stranger who, somehow, had become her anchor that night. "I was a medical student," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I always dreamed of being a doctor. I wanted to save lives, make a difference. But then, my mother got sick. Cancer. I had to drop out of college to take care of her. She was everything I had." Guillermo listened attentively, not interrupting, as Anastasia continued, her words flowing more easily now, as if unburdening herself was a relief. "I did everything I could, but she didn't make it. And then, the worst happened. The apartment we lived in caught fire. It was my stepfather. He was drunk, as always, and left a cigarette burning. The fire started during the night, and I barely managed to escape with my life." She paused, her eyes misty, lost in some point in the past. "I lost everything. I had nowhere to go. Since then, I've been on the streets. I tried, really tried, to find work, to move on, but everything seemed to crumble at once." Guillermo felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing this. It wasn't just the tragedy that had struck her, but the cruelty of a fate that seemed too merciless for someone so young. He thought of his own pain, the loss he carried with him, but realized that, compared to what Anastasia faced, his suffering seemed smaller, almost insignificant. "Anastasia," he said softly, leaning a bit closer, "I can't change what happened, but I can offer you a chance to start over." She looked at him, surprised, as if his words were incomprehensible. "What do you mean?" "My son, Teo, is very ill. He needs constant care, and I need someone I can trust to be with him. You were a medical student. You know how to care for someone, and I need help. Would you accept to work for me?" Anastasia fell silent, absorbing the proposal. It was as if a rope had been thrown to her amid the turbulent ocean in which she found herself. But then, a doubt arose in her mind. "Why would you do this for me? I'm just a stranger." "You're not just a stranger," Guillermo replied firmly. "You are someone who needs help, just like I do. Perhaps we are here, on this night, for a reason. Maybe in some way, we can save each other." She held his gaze, searching for some proof that this wasn't just a dream, an empty promise. Finally, after a long moment of silence, Anastasia nodded slowly, a new determination rising in her eyes. "I accept." Guillermo smiled, relieved, but within himself, he carried a truth he still didn't dare to reveal. Teo's case was serious, possibly terminal, and he knew the road ahead would be difficult, both for him and for Anastasia. But for now, he decided there was hope. And perhaps, just perhaps, that unlikely meeting could change everything. The next day, Guillermo took Anastasia to his home. The Castro mansion was an imposing structure located in one of the most upscale areas of New York. As they passed through the high iron gates, which opened with a low, dragging sound, Anastasia couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and apprehension. The place was grand, but there was something somber about the way the house loomed against the gray sky, as if it held secrets long buried. Guillermo led her through the main entrance, whose solid wooden doors opened to reveal a hall decorated with crystal chandeliers and marble staircases that elegantly wound up to the upper floors. The walls were adorned with oil paintings of pastoral landscapes and family portraits, but the atmosphere of the place was heavy, almost oppressive. It was a house that, despite all its beauty, seemed built to imprison emotions, not to welcome them. Anastasia felt small before such grandeur, but there was something within her that told her this place held more than just riches. It held secrets. It was as if the walls, so immaculate, concealed stories that no one dared to tell. Isabel, Guillermo's wife, was waiting for them in the living room. Upon seeing her, Anastasia felt a shiver run down her spine. Isabel was a tall, slender woman with aristocratic features and eyes that seemed to pierce anyone who stared at them for too long. Her blonde hair was impeccably styled in a bun, and her elegant dress contrasted with the cold, calculating expression she wore. "Guillermo," Isabel said, her voice sounding like ice breaking. "You didn't mention you would bring someone to work here." Guillermo, trying to remain calm, introduced Anastasia. "This is Anastasia. She will take care of Teo. We need someone qualified and trustworthy, Isabel." Isabel looked Anastasia up and down, her expression changing just enough to reveal a hint of disdain. "Are you sure this is the best choice?" The question was directed at Guillermo, but the tone made it clear that Isabel's opinion was already formed. Guillermo nodded, determined. "Yes, I am." Anastasia remained silent, feeling the discomfort grow within her, but determined not to let Isabel's initial hostility intimidate her. She knew she needed this job, and more than that, she needed to prove to herself that she was still capable of caring for someone. "I hope you know what you're doing," Isabel said finally, before turning and leaving the room, her dress swirling as she ascended the stairs with a rigidity that reflected her disapproval. Guillermo sighed, running a hand through his hair as if trying to dissipate the tension that now hung in the air. "Don't worry about her," he said to Anastasia, trying to sound reassuring. "Isabel can be difficult, but in the end, everything will work out." He led her to the second floor, where Teo's room was located. When they opened the door, Anastasia saw a pale boy lying on a large bed, surrounded by medical equipment monitoring his vital signs. Teo looked fragile, his brown hair tangled in a white pillow, his eyes closed in restless sleep. "This is Teo," Guillermo said, his voice soft, laden with a sadness he struggled to hide. "He has been my greatest concern since everything happened." Anastasia approached the bed, feeling a wave of empathy wash over her at the sight of the boy, so small and vulnerable. She knew her presence here was more than just a job. It was a mission of hope, a last thread of connection between her and the world. "I will take care of him," she promised, more to herself than to Guillermo. "I will do my best." Guillermo nodded, leaving her alone in the room with Teo, as if he needed that moment to prepare himself, to assume the role that had been given to him. Anastasia began to examine the equipment, checking medication levels and Teo's condition. But while she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was Isabel. Shortly after, when Anastasia stepped out of Teo's room to fetch more medical supplies, she found Isabel in the hallway, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, looking at her with an expression that was anything but welcoming. "You might fool Guillermo," Isabel said, her voice low and venomous. "But I see who you really are. Don't think you can come into our lives and... I don't know what your plans are, but I'm not a fool." Anastasia took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm just here to help Teo," she replied, keeping her gaze steady on Isabel's. Isabel stepped closer, her presence almost suffocating. "We'll see," she said, before stepping away with a cold smile on her lips. The days that followed were difficult for Anastasia. She dedicated herself tirelessly to Teo's care, who, despite his critical condition, was beginning to show signs of improvement, even if small. However, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly tense. Isabel seemed determined to make her miserable, using small acts of cruelty to sabotage Anastasia's work. The situation reached a breaking point when, one morning, Anastasia entered Teo's room and found him struggling to breathe. The boy was covered in red spots and appeared to be in agony. Desperate, she called for Guillermo, who came running, and upon seeing his son's condition, panicked. "What happened?" Guillermo demanded to know, while Anastasia, struggling to keep calm, checked for possible causes of the sudden allergic reaction. It was then that she noticed something strange in the air, a fine powder, almost imperceptible, that had been spread throughout the room. She looked at Guillermo, her face paling as she realized the gravity of the situation. "This isn't an accident," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone did this on purpose." Guillermo, with his heart aching with worry for Teo, immediately thought of Isabel. He didn't want to believe it, but her behavior in recent days. It all made sense now. He needed to be sure. "I'll solve this," he said, striding out of the room, leaving Anastasia to care for Teo. Deep down, Guillermo knew that his wife was hiding secrets, but he never imagined she could put their child's life at risk. He didn't know how he would face it, but he knew that the trust remaining between him and Isabel was about to be shattered forever. Guillermo felt the weight of each step as he descended the stairs, heading toward the office where he knew he would find Isabel. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, all converging into a single certainty. He needed to confirm his suspicions. The woman with whom he had shared a life was capable of a cruelty he had never imagined, and this discovery was destroying him from the inside. Upon entering the office, he found Isabel sitting at his desk, calmly flipping through a book as if nothing had happened. She lifted her eyes when he walked in but said nothing, merely observing him with the same coldness that characterized her. "Isabel, we need to talk," Guillermo said, his voice firm but laden with a sadness he couldn't hide. Isabel closed the book with a snap, folding her hands over it as if patiently waiting. "What is it this time, Guillermo? Worried about the new nurse? I'm not surprised." "It's not about her. It's about Teo," Guillermo replied, his gaze piercing hers. "You put something in his room, something that almost killed him." For a moment, Isabel's mask of calm seemed to waver, but she quickly composed herself again. "What are you talking about? Are you accusing me of harming my own child?" Guillermo stepped closer to the desk, leaning forward, his voice now a harsh whisper. "I'm not just accusing, Isabel. I know what you did. And to be honest, I'm tired of trying to understand your actions. There are cameras in Teo's room and they recorded everything." Isabel paled, her hands gripping the book tighter. For a moment, it seemed she would deny it. But then something shifted in her gaze. A mix of desperation and fury took over her, and Isabel abruptly stood up, pushing the chair back with a violent motion. "Do you really think you can judge me, Guillermo? After everything we've been through? You left me alone with this child while you drowned in your own grief, in your own guilt." "What do you mean by that, Isabel? Does that justify what you did?" Guillermo was stunned, but tried to keep his voice steady. "Teo was never your son, Guillermo," Isabel shot back, her voice heavy with bitterness. "He is Sebastian's son, and I kept that secret for years because I knew that if you found out, you would leave me. And now you want to destroy me over some nurse?" Her words hit Guillermo like a violent blow. He staggered back, feeling the ground slip from under his feet. Everything he believed, everything he had fought for, suddenly made no sense. Teo was not his son? The revelation left him paralyzed, unable to react immediately. I can't believe it," he murmured, his voice faltering as the world around him seemed to crumble. "I did what I thought was best," Isabel continued, now with a cold and distant tone. I protected our family. But you have always been weak, always lived in the shadows of your own suffering, unable to see what was really happening around you. Guillermo felt the anger rising within him, but he couldn't express it. All he could do was stare at Isabel, the woman he thought he knew, and realize that in truth, he had never really known her at all. Without saying another word, he left the office, leaving her alone, her words still echoing in his mind. As he exited, Guillermo decided that he needed to confront the situation. It was time for Isabel to face the consequences of her actions, and he knew exactly what to do. In the following hours, everything happened in a blur. The police were called, Isabel was arrested and taken for questioning. Guillermo remained in a heavy silence, trying to process everything he had discovered. When the officers took her away, Isabel looked at him one last time, her eyes still cold, showing no sign of remorse. And then she was out of his life, leaving a void that Guillermo didn't know how to fill. After Isabel's arrest, the Castro house fell into an unsettling silence, an emotional void that Guillermo didn't know how to fill. He spent hours wandering the halls of the mansion, thoughts echoing in his mind, endlessly repeating the words Isabel had said. Teo was not his biological son. This fact, this new reality, crushed the little strength that remained within him. He withdrew from everyone, including Anastasia and Teo. The pain of betrayal, mixed with doubt about every decision he had made in the last few years, was corroding his soul. Guillermo took refuge in his office, drinking to try to drown the memories, to silence the voice that told him his entire life had been a lie. Each empty bottle was an attempt to numb himself, to erase the truths he now knew, but relief never came, and the pain only grew. Meanwhile, Teo, not understanding why his father had suddenly distanced himself, began to deteriorate. His already fragile health worsened, and he started asking for Guillermo with alarming frequency. Anastasia did her best to keep the boy comfortable, but she knew he needed his father. She understood that if Guillermo didn't find his way back to his son, it might be too late. One night, after yet another exhausting day caring for Teo, Anastasia could no longer hold back. She went to Guillermo's office, where she found the man who once seemed so strong, now reduced to a shadow of himself. The empty bottle beside him, the vacant gaze, everything indicated how deeply he had fallen. "Guillermo," she called softly, approaching him yet firmly. "Teo needs you. He is getting worse." Guillermo did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the wall. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, laden with despair. "I am not his father, Anastasia. Everything was a lie." Anastasia took a deep breath, feeling the pain in his words, but she could not allow him to sink further. "That doesn't matter right now. Teo needs you, the person you are to him, not who he came to be biologically. He calls you Dad, Guillermo, and that's what you are. No DNA test can change that." Guillermo looked at her for the first time that night, his eyes filled with tears he tried to hold back but couldn't. "I don't know how to be strong enough for this," he admitted, his voice faltering. "You don't have to be strong alone," Anastasia replied, her voice steady. "I am here. Teo is here. But we need you. He needs his father." Guillermo closed his eyes, allowing the tears to spill down his face, no longer able to contain the pain. Anastasia placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort, but also of urgency. "Guillermo, you need to be present for him. Now, more than ever. We can't lose any more time." With tremendous effort, Guillermo nodded slowly, knowing she was right. He had to overcome his own suffering for Teo's sake. He stood up, still trembling, but resolute. "I will do this," he said, his voice still weak, but with newfound determination. Anastasia accompanied him back to Teo's room, where the boy slept, his breathing irregular, his face pale. As Guillermo approached the bed, he saw how fragile his son was, and the love he felt for him, that love that even Isabel's revelations could not destroy, filled his heart. He held Teo's hand, feeling the weak warmth still emanating from him, and whispered, "I'm here, son. Daddy is here." Teo, even in his restless sleep, seemed to relax upon hearing his father's voice, and Guillermo knew he had done the right thing. Though doubts and suffering haunted him, he realized he could not abandon Teo. The boy needed him, and he would be there, as he always should have been. Anastasia, standing beside them, watched that moment with a mix of relief and hope. She knew the road ahead would still be long and filled with obstacles, but for now, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that was what mattered most. The following days were an immense challenge for Guillermo. Although he was physically present, the internal struggle he faced was constant. Caring for Teo, seeing him in such a fragile state, was painful. But every small moment by the boy's side, every weak smile, every murmured word, helped to rebuild something within Guillermo, something he thought he had lost forever. Anastasia continued to be by their side, tireless in her care for Teo and her support for Guillermo. Her presence made things more bearable, and slowly, Guillermo began to open up to her in ways he had never done with anyone. The shared pain brought them closer, creating a bond that transcended the simple roles of caregiver and employer. It was as if, by caring for Teo together, they were also healing their own wounds. But then, on a particularly cold morning, something happened that cast a new shadow over that fragile hope. Anastasia began to feel a slight pain in her chest, which quickly intensified. Trying to ignore it, she continued with her tasks, but the pain became unbearable, and she fell to her knees, struggling to breathe. Guillermo, who was next to Teo, heard the noise and ran to find Anastasia lying on the ground, breathless, her face contorted in pain. Panic took hold of him as he helped her to her feet, holding her carefully. "Anastasia, what's happening?" he asked, his voice choked with fear. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Guillermo quickly took her to the hospital, where she was treated as an emergency case. The news they received could not have been worse. Anastasia had developed a serious lung condition due to smoke inhalation from the fire caused by Isabel. The diagnosis shook Guillermo to his core. He had thought the worst was behind them, but now he faced the possibility of losing Anastasia too, the only person who had brought a ray of hope into his shattered life. He spent the night in the hospital by her side, holding her hand while she slept, the fear of losing her growing in his chest. When Anastasia woke up, her eyes met his, and even weak, she smiled, a gesture that, despite everything, carried the same strength and determination she had always possessed. "You need to take care of Teo, Guillermo," she said, her voice weak but firm. "He needs you more than ever." Guillermo nodded, squeezing her hand. "I know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need you too. I can't do this alone." Anastasia looked at him, her eyes softening with affection. "You're not alone," she whispered. "We will get through this, together." Those words, simple yet full of meaning, brought a new sense of determination to Guillermo. He knew that despite everything, he needed to keep fighting, not just for Teo, but for Anastasia, for the new family he was beginning to form, even if in an unexpected way. With Isabel out of their lives, the Castro mansion became a quieter place, though it still bore the traces of the recent chaos. Anastasia, now recovering, was transferred back to the mansion, where she could be monitored and cared for with the necessary resources. Guillermo refused to leave her side, dedicating himself entirely to both her and Teo. In the days that followed, a subtle yet powerful change occurred between Guillermo and Anastasia. Their closeness grew not just out of necessity, but from the affection and mutual respect that blossomed amid adversity. Guillermo's love for Teo, which had never waned, became even stronger. The boy, even in his fragility, seemed to respond to his father's constant presence and Anastasia's gentle care. One night, after a long and exhausting day of caring for Teo, Guillermo and Anastasia found themselves alone in the living room. The silence that enveloped the mansion was no longer oppressive, but comforting. They sat together, Guillermo wrapping an arm around Anastasia, who rested her head on his shoulder. "I never imagined things would end up like this," Guillermo said, his voice low but full of sincerity. "After everything that happened, I thought I would lose you too." Anastasia looked at him, her eyes reflecting the same vulnerability he felt. "I was scared too," she admitted, "but somehow, here we are, caring for each other. I finally feel like I'm part of something." Guillermo turned to her, his gaze softer yet more intense than ever. "You are a part of this, Anastasia, a part of my life. And I think I'm falling in love with you." Anastasia's heart leapt, and she felt tears beginning to form. "I am too," she whispered, unable to hide how much those words meant to her. "I think I always have been, since that day on the bridge." Guillermo leaned in and kissed her, a gesture that sealed the promise that together they would face whatever came their way. It was a love born of pain, but also of hope and resilience, making it all the more precious. In the days that followed, their union solidified. Teo, still fragile, began to improve. The love and care he received from Guillermo and Anastasia seemed to have a healing effect, not only on his body, but also on his spirit. The first time he called Anastasia Mommy was a moment that brought tears to both their eyes. Guillermo, deeply touched, knew that this was the family he had longed for, even if he had never imagined finding it in such an unlikely way. It was on a sunny afternoon, while walking through the garden, that Guillermo made the decision that would change everything. He stopped, holding Anastasia's hands, and looked into her eyes with a sincerity that came from the depths of his heart. "Anastasia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I know this may seem sudden, but I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Not out of gratitude, but because I truly love you." Anastasia was momentarily speechless, her eyes misty as a wave of happiness washed over her. She smiled, a smile that reflected their entire journey together. "Yes, Guillermo," she replied, her words coming out with a mix of laughter and tears. "Yes, I will marry you." The wedding was simple but full of meaning. Held in the mansion itself, with Teo by their side, the moment was a celebration of love and overcoming struggles. As Guillermo looked at Anastasia in her white dress, he knew he had found not just a partner, but a new reason to live, someone who had brought light into his darkness. As the vows were exchanged, Guillermo felt that he was finally closing a chapter and beginning a new one. The pain of the past was still there, but now it was part of a larger story, a story of redemption, love, and hope. The day of Guillermo and Anastasia's wedding dawned with a soft light filtering through the curtains of the Castro mansion, flooding the rooms with a serenity they were still getting used to feeling. It was a simple day, without grand preparations or the pomp that often accompanies such events. But for them, it was perfect. Every detail had been planned with heart, with the love that had blossomed amid pain and chaos. Teo was especially excited. Although still fragile, his health had improved considerably in recent weeks. He insisted on helping organize the ceremony, filling the atmosphere with joy through his childlike enthusiasm. Guillermo couldn't take his eyes off his son, remembering all the moments he feared he might not be present to witness this day. The ceremony took place in the mansion's garden, under an archway of white flowers that Anastasia had helped choose. Few people were present, just close friends, but that only made the moment more intimate and meaningful. When Guillermo saw Anastasia walking towards him, dressed in white, his heart filled with a peace he could barely remember feeling before. The woman who had saved his life was there, walking towards him to seal the love that had grown between them. The vows were exchanged with sincere words, spoken with voices laden with emotion. Guillermo promised Anastasia that, no matter what the future held, he would stand by her side, caring for and protecting her, just as she had done for him and Teo. Anastasia, in turn, promised to love him with all her strength, to continue being the partner he deserved, and to give Teo all the love of a mother. After the kiss that sealed their union, Teo ran to them, embracing them with all the strength his small arms could muster. That moment, so simple yet so powerful, was witnessed by everyone present, and no one could hold back their tears of joy. Later, during the reception, as guests toasted to the new family, Guillermo felt there was something more he needed to share. He stepped away for a moment, returning with an envelope in hand. Anastasia, noticing the seriousness in his gaze, approached him, curious. "Anastasia," Guillermo began, drawing the attention of everyone around. "There's something I need to say, something I discovered recently that, for me, changes everything, but at the same time, changes nothing." He opened the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper, holding it carefully. "This is a DNA test," he continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I took this test a few weeks ago, and it confirmed what Isabel told me. Teo is not my biological son." A murmur of surprise swept through the crowd, but Guillermo raised his hand, requesting silence. "This could have been devastating for me," he said, his voice choked. "But what I realized is that the love I feel for Teo is not defined by blood. I raised him, loved him from the very first moment I saw him, and nothing, not even the biological truth, can change the fact that he is my son. I chose to be his father, and I will continue to be." Anastasia felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at Guillermo, awed by the strength and love he was demonstrating. Teo, not fully understanding what was happening but sensing the weight of the moment, hugged Guillermo tightly, as if he instinctively knew he was being protected from a truth he was still too young to comprehend. As everyone processed Guillermo's words, Anastasia received a call. She discreetly stepped away to answer, but the words she heard left her breathless. It was a lawyer informing her that her father, whom she thought had been dead for many years, was alive, and was a millionaire desperately looking for her. The revelation hit her like a bomb in her mind. The lawyer explained that her father, after years of believing that Anastasia was dead, had finally discovered the truth and was determined to find her. Anastasia could hardly believe what she was hearing, but one thing was certain. This would completely change the future for her, Guillermo, and Teo. She returned to the party, still in shock, but with a firm decision in her heart. Guillermo, noticing the shift in her expression, asked what had happened. "Guillermo," she said, her voice a bit shaky, "I just found out that my father is alive. He's a millionaire and has been looking for me for years. This changes everything." Guillermo looked at her, surprised but not alarmed. He held her hands firmly. "Whatever the future brings us, we will face it together. No matter how many changes come our way, what we have is real, and we will confront this with the same strength that has brought us here." Anastasia nodded, feeling a mix of fear and hope. She knew their journey was far from over, that new challenges and secrets awaited them. But now, she was no longer alone. And that, more than any fortune, was what really mattered. As the party continued, the new family prepared to face whatever was to come, knowing that together they could overcome anything. They had found in each other the strength to move forward, and they were ready to tackle the new challenges and possibilities that the future would bring, with love, courage, and renewed hope. This was the true victory, and with that, the story that began on a dark, cold night was now unfolding on a horizon full of light and promises. We hope you enjoyed this surprising story. Help the channel by leaving a like. Continue following our amazing stories. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Share your stories, suggestions, and critiques in the comments.